So recently I received this comment on one of my videos that I made about learning Spanish through comprehensible input. And it says, do you write notes when taking in the content? Well, this seemed like an excellent question to me. And so I want to answer today for Javen and for all of you who may be wondering, what do I actually do while I am consuming the comprehensible input? Let's talk about it. So guys, when you are learning Spanish, there are a few things more important than making sure that you have enough contact with the language in a more natural state. So I'm not talking about list of vocabulary in Spanish and conjugation tables in Spanish. I'm talking about Spanish in its natural habitat. So dialogues, conversations, stories, maybe even listening to someone give a presentation. Whatever you can do to have that contact with Spanish is very important. And when that information that we are listening to or reading is what we could say one level above our actual level, so it's something that we can follow along with, but it does contain new words so that we're actually learning, that's what we call comprehensible input. And today, guys, we're going to be talking about comprehensible input, but also just input in general, because there are times that you may be exposing yourself to Spanish that is actually even above that level of comprehensible input. It's not so comprehensible for you, but it still can be beneficial. So we're going to be talking more about input in general today. I just want to get that out of the way. Now, there are many different ways in which you can use input, and today I want to talk about 3 different ones, and I'm actually going to leave my favorite for last because I'm going to be showing you a demonstration of exactly how it can work. But for method number 1, let's talk about listening to something, just listening and actually taking notes. Taking notes in the more traditional sense that for most of us comes to mind when we think about taking notes, like listening to someone speak and taking notes on that. Let's start with that first, because that's actually something that I did do quite a bit. So when I started learning Spanish, a lot of that involved listening, and a lot of that happened to be listening to Spanish in real time from a real speaker speaking. And so this input for me at first was not at the comprehensible level. It was like way up there. And so all I was trying to do was just follow along with what was even going on. So there was no way at first that I could take notes. I was there only listening, trying to follow along with what was happening. But within a relatively short time, after continuing to listen and continuing to work with Spanish on my own as well, I started to be able to understand more, and that's when I did start to take notes, like literal notes in a notebook. What did those notes look like? Well, there were usually phrases of the key points, the key information, and I may have written unfamiliar words there as well. But most of it was phrases, everything kept in context. You know how when you're taking notes, often you don't have time to write out a whole sentence. And so really my notes in Spanish reflected the same type of notes that I would take in English if I were doing the same type of thing. And the interesting thing is that I wasn't taking those notes actually to improve my Spanish, or I wasn't even thinking about the Spanish actually. Rather, I was taking them because they were actually points that I wanted to remember for my life or to share it with someone else. So again, very similar to the reason and the way that I would take notes in English or any other language. I mention this because one of the things that I want you to know, and that I've mentioned several times on the channel, is that when you learn Spanish or when you learn any language through material or through subjects and topics that are relevant or interesting to you anyway, you may find yourself doing other activities like taking notes without thinking so much about the language. So you will end up doing beneficial activities for your actual language progression without actually thinking about it so much, which is a huge, huge plus. Now, as I mentioned, I couldn't start this note-taking process from day 1. At first, it was survival mode, and I was only trying to listen and pick out the bits and pieces that I could. So this method of listening to Spanish in real time and taking notes in real time is obviously not going to be the best method for a complete beginner, but it is one method that you can have in mind. But let's move on to the second one. In addition to the fact that your listening comprehension may not yet be at the level where you can take notes in real time. There are also sometimes moments when most of us don't really want to take those kinds of notes. Like if we're enjoying some music in Spanish or watching a show in Spanish. For a lot of us, at least for me, it would be kind of strange for me to have a desire to take notes on that in Spanish or any other language. Now, some of you may be different. Some of you may like to, for the purpose of language learning, actually take some notes while you're listening to things like music or watching TV. That's just not me though. However, if you are listening to something and you don't have a desire to take notes, but you also don't want it to be a very passive experience because you want to get the most out of it as you possibly can, then you can listen actively. To listen actively, you may have to give what you're listening to more than one pass. So the first time, maybe you're just trying to follow along with what the general idea is, maybe who the characters are in this audiobook that you're listening to or something like that. And then when you listen again, there will likely be more details that you can fill in this time. There may be words that you hear the second time that you missed the first time because they were spoken too quickly or because there was connected speech. So every time you listen to it, you're likely going to be able to pick out more and more, assuming that you are actively working on building up your vocabulary. And we'll talk about that even more in method number 3. But if you are working with Spanish, then the more that you listen, the more times you listen, the more that you are going to be able to pick up. So even though you may be just listening and not taking notes, it is still a very active process and excellent, absolutely excellent for your listening comprehension practice. Now, we haven't talked about reading yet. We've been talking about listening. Method number 3, my personal favorite, is where we're going to combine listening and reading, and it's going to be a very powerful combination. And this is where you're really going to be actively working on building up your vocabulary and so many other skills. And so I'm going to teach you this in 4 different steps. Now, in reality, you could do a lot with this. And if you also wanted to take this method and expand it and work on your pronunciation and your writing and your speaking, you definitely could. And it would be more than 4 steps. In fact, I have 10 steps listed in my Spanish Fluency Blueprint, which is a free download that you can go grab for free, ericaraelanguage.com/blueprint, where I outline all of the steps for you to work on literally all of your skills using one piece of comprehensible input. But today we're going to simplify it a little bit, and I'm going to talk about 4 basic steps that I always want you to have in mind when you do have that time to just kind of sit down and actively work on your Spanish. Now, in order to apply method number 3, what you'll need is audio and text that matches the audio. This could be an audiobook with the ebook, it could be a podcast with a transcript, a YouTube video with subtitles, whatever it is that has both the audio and the text. Like the stories that I have on this channel, you can download all of them so that you have the text to go with it. So step number 1 is to only listen. Or if you have visuals to go along, like if this is a show or something that has visuals with it, then go ahead and use that as well. Perfectly fine. But we're not bringing in the text yet. Number 2 is to listen while you read. Number 3 is to break apart the information, and number 4 is to go back and listen and read. Okay? So we're going to demonstrate each one of these steps using an excerpt from one of my stories that I have on this channel called Obsessive. So let's take step 1 and let's only listen and watch.
También tengo que lavarme las manos muchas veces al día. Es por los gérmenes que hay en todas partes. No quiero enfermarme ni enfermar a mi hermano. Así que cuando hay algún plato sucio, yo soy la primera en lavarlo, porque así aprovecho para lavarme las manos otra vez, sin que nadie se dé cuenta.
Why in step 1 are we really interested in listening and just looking? Well, this is to train our listening comprehension. And you can do as many passes of the material as you would like. Just like in method number 2, when we were talking about the active listening, consider step 1 of this method number 3, just that active listening step, okay? Go through it as many times as you can and extract all of the juice out of it that you can. And once you feel like this is the limit, you know, these other words, I actually can't hear them or I just don't know them, that's when we go to step 2 and we add in the text. And doing it this way helps your ear get used to being able to distinguish Spanish words without the text helping you, because when you are in a conversation, there are no subtitles coming out of the other person's mouth. So it's going to be really important that you have trained your ear, that you're used to trying to distinguish what is being said. And the nice thing is that you can do it right now in a controlled environment without pressure. So now in step number 2, we bring in the text. So let's go through that one page again and see if seeing the words help you understand better what is going on.
También tengo que lavarme las manos muchas veces al día. Es por los gérmenes que hay en todas partes. No quiero enfermarme ni enfermar a mi hermano. Así que cuando hay algún plato sucio, yo soy la primera en lavarlo, porque así aprovecho para lavarme las manos otra vez, sin que nadie se dé cuenta.
Do you feel like you were able to understand better looking at the words? Well, if you're like many people, that was probably the case. Why? Well, it's for a lot of reasons. One, you can now actually see where a word begins and where it ends. You actually know what words are contained in that story, even if you don't know the meaning behind all of them. Also, you may notice certain words that look just like English and happen to be cognates, true cognates that mean the same thing or a similar thing, to where you can kind of figure it out when you're looking at it. But maybe your ear just missed that the first time. Maybe when you hear the word gérmenes that starts with that H sound, maybe you don't know what that means, but when you see it, it actually starts with germ. It's longer than that. There are a few more letters, but the word actually does mean germs, gérmenes. So you may perceive that with your eye, even though your ear may have missed it. Did you see the word enfermar and enfermarme? When you look at that word, do you notice that it looks like the English word for infirm? Does that remind you of a person who's sick? Well, enfermar does mean to make sick. So that is something that you may be able to visually see even if you didn't hear it the first time. These are just examples, and you may have noticed other things, but the point is that adding the visuals now at this point will help you understand further. Step number 3 is to break apart that text and that audio. But I say text because now looking at the text, it is easier to see what words you simply don't know. Maybe you want to look them up. Maybe you don't want to look up all of them, but maybe there's a word that keeps coming up over and over. Like the page we just listened to, we said lavar, enfermar. You know, if those were things that you didn't know, you'll probably want to look those up to be able to understand the general idea of what that page is talking about. This is the point where you can take notes in a sense. Maybe you look up a word and you're taking notes on what that word means. Maybe you find a word with more than one meaning and you jot that down, but you kind of figure out which of the meanings is going with this text. For example, maybe you see the word plato, and from the context, you're thinking that that might mean plate. And plato definitely can mean plate. But maybe when you look that up, you also find that plato, platos, can mean dishes, just dishes in general. Well, that's the interesting fact. That's a note that you may want to just jot down for your reference. So these are the kinds of interesting things that you discover when you're breaking apart that information. And don't make it stressful, just make it fun. This is the opportunity to really quench your curiosity about everything that's going on in this story or whatever it is that you're reading. I love stories personally. That's why I write them and publish some of them here for you guys. But you're going to be working with anything that has audio and text. Is there an interesting grammatical point that you noticed? Like you're wondering, why does this say enfermar and this says enfermarme? Maybe you discover reflexive verbs in that moment, but that discovery came from a story. It came from something that you were investigating. Trust me, those things are going to stick so much better than if you're just going over reflexive verbs because it's the next chapter of your textbook. And step number 4 is to go back and read and listen again. You can read and listen at the same time. Again, just like you did in step number 2, or you could just listen if you wanted, just like you did in step number 1. But the point is just to let all that new information that you just looked up, those new words, those new meanings, you just let them marinate, because you just let them kind of simmer there in the new context. So what have we learned? We have learned 3 different ways that you can make use of input and comprehensible input. Some of these involve taking notes, some of them don't. Method number 1, we talked about hearing Spanish in real time and taking notes in short phrases and keywords, things like that. In method number 2, we talked about active listening. So this is something that you can listen to more than once because you're no longer in real time. So every time that you listen, you can extract more and more with your ear. And you're focused as much as you can, trying to extract all that you can. That's another way to take in comprehensible input. Number 3, it's a very comprehensive method using both audio and text and extracting what you can and then breaking it down and then going back and listening and reading again. One thing that we haven't covered in this video is what to do if you're only reading, if you're reading without audio. So I'll leave that for another video. The reason that I have focused on these today is because it is so important when you are beginning to learn Spanish to listen and to listen a lot. But of course, as you advance and if there are moments that you just want to do some reading by itself, that is wonderful as well. So in another video, we'll talk about what you can do while you are reading Spanish, text only. I hope this video has been helpful and has helped to answer the question, should I take notes while I'm consuming my input? If so, give me a like and let me know about it by leaving me a comment. Tell me which of these methods you like to use the most, or are you considering one of them, or do you do something else? I would love to hear about it. Once again, if you would like to download my free blueprint, which contains even more steps that you can add with one piece of comprehensible input, more ways in which you can take advantage of it, then definitely go download that. I will have the link here below. Until next time, guys, don't forget to go out and live your new language today. Bye-bye.